When the cowboy came back to his lonely homestead that evening, he never expected to find a stranger in his bed, or that it would change everything he knew about living. The sun had already slipped behind the ridges when Jack Carter rode down the rocky slope toward his small cabin. The chill bit deep, sharper than most late autumn nights, the kind of cold that crawled into a man's bones and reminded him he wasn't young anymore. His horse's hooves struck the frozen ground in a steady rhythm. He didn't rush. There was no one waiting inside those log walls, only silence, and he'd grown used to it. For 6 long years, silence had been his only company. Since the fever had taken Caroline Everhart and their little boy Thomas Carter Jack had kept busy with chores and fences, because work was the only thing that dulled the ache. His cabin stood where the cottonwoods thinned a rough shelter built by his own hands when he first staked the land. Time and storms had leaned it a little, patched it with mud, and scarred its roof. Yet that evening, a thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney. Jack hadn't lit a fire that morning. The sight froze him where he sat in the saddle. Slowly he dismounted his boots, crunching over frost-hardened dirt. He tied the reins to the post, his right hand instinctively resting near the cold metal on his hip, a habit carved deep by years surviving on the frontier. He didn't call out. He never did. The door groaned as he pushed it open. Warmth met him inside warmth that shouldn't have been there. A fire burned in the stone hearth flames, throwing their glow over the rough table, the single stool, the cot against the far wall. And on that cot lay a woman. She wasn't asleep. Her half-open eyes watched him wary and weary. Long black hair spilled across the blanket in tangled strands. Her buckskin dress, dirt-stained and torn, clung loosely to her frame, ripped low at the neckline so that the fabric barely held together. She couldn't have been more than 25, though her face carried the wear of hard years. Bruises shadowed her arms. One cheek was swollen, her lips cracked and dry. Jack froze in the doorway. He'd seen Apache before, mostly from a distance, sometimes across battle lines when he'd been forced to scout during his younger years. He knew enough to understand what kind of danger came from being found with one inside his home. If the neighbors heard, if word reached town men like Wade Bonner would start asking questions, and questions out here usually led to blood. His pulse quickened. He could drag her outside, let the night and the cold finish what others had started. That would be safer. Easier. It's what survival demanded. But as he stood there, hand near his revolver, he saw her trembling hands clutching the blanket. She wasn't a threat. She was starving, beaten, exhausted, and barely holding on. For a fleeting moment, Jack's thoughts drifted back to Caroline's final hours. Her limp hand in his. The shallow breaths of his dying son. He had buried his family once, and the memory of it still hollowed him out. To cast this woman into the freezing dark. He couldn't. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him. His boots thudded on the plank floor as he crossed to the table. The woman's gaze followed him wide and frightened. Jack set down his pack, pulled out a crust of bread left from town, and placed it on the table. Then he slid it toward her side of the room. He didn't speak. He wasn't a man of words, never had been. She pushed herself up slowly. The blanket slipped to her waist, showing bruised shoulders and the torn edge of her dress. Jack kept his eyes fixed on her face. She reached for the bread fingers shaking and ate like someone who hadn't tasted food in days. Something inside him tightened, part pity, part unease. He didn't know her story yet, but her scars spoke plenty. She'd been hunted, hurt, left behind. All she wanted now was a place to rest, maybe for one night. Jack leaned back on the stool, arms crossed, his revolver within easy reach. The fire popped and cracked between them. Her eyes stayed on him as she chewed. There was no plea, no word of thanks, only the quiet acknowledgement that he hadn't turned her away. He'd learn her name later. Aiyana Skyfeather. A woman torn from her people, traded among cruel hands, and finally set free only because she'd managed to escape. That night, two broken souls, one haunted by loss, one fleeing from pain, found themselves under the same roof. And neither of them yet knew how much their lives were about to change. Her only purpose now was to survive, nothing else, nothing more. Jack Carter's purpose, though he'd never dared to say it aloud, was simpler still, to keep breathing in a world that had already taken everything from him. Two shattered souls crossed paths that night in a cabin built for one. The question lingered between them like smoke. Would he send her away or let her stay? Jack looked at Aiyana Skyfeather one last time, before leaning back, his decision already made. She would stay. For now. He didn't sleep much that night. The rifle stayed within arm's reach, propped against the wall beside the cot, while he sat half upright on the stool watching the fire die to embers. The woman slept on his bed, her body wrapped in his old blanket, her breathing shallow, restless. Every now and then her eyes flicked open, searching for him, making sure he hadn't moved. He didn't. He sat still, jaw locked tight, listening to the wind scraping against the logs. By dawn, the room was cold again. Jack rose, fed wood to the fire, and went about his morning with the same quiet discipline that had kept him alive for years. The soft scrape of his boots, the clink of his knife on the table, the sound of water poured into a tin cup. Those were the small sounds that filled his life now. When he set the cup down, he slid it toward her again, just as he'd done with the bread. She stirred, blinking awake in the gray light. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He realized then she probably didn't speak much English. Maybe none at all. Bits of Apache came back to him, rough words from his scouting days, orders shouted across camps. But they wouldn't carry far in any real conversation. That was fine. Jack wasn't much for talking anyway. He watched as she lifted the cup with both hands, sipping slow. Her fingers were small bruises, dark along her wrists, where ropes had once bitten into her skin. That detail caught him hard. Someone had bound her not long ago, and whoever had done it might still be out there. The thought sank heavy in his gut. If they came looking and found her here, it'd be him against however many men they brought. He could tell her to leave right now. He thought about it more than once. His life was quiet, predictable, safe. Trouble was something he'd learned to avoid. But each time that thought surfaced, he caught sight of her hands shaking as she lifted the cup. The bruises along her cheek, the rise of her chest under the blanket, faint but steady. And suddenly, a memory cut through him. Caroline Everhart, pale and fading in her final hours, with little Thomas Carter curled beside her, too weak to even drink water. He'd lived through that once, watched helplessly while life slipped away from the people he loved most. He wasn't about to stand by and watch another life fade in front of him. When she set the cup down, she glanced at him, then at the door, measuring whether he'd stop her if she tried to leave. Jack didn't move. "Stay," he said quietly, the word rough from disuse. She blinked, lips pressing together, then lowered her gaze. Whether she fully understood or not, she didn't rise. She only pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. That was enough. Jack grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The cold slapped his face sharp and clean. He split wood in the yard, each swing of the axe steady his mind, trying to drive out the questions clawing at him. How had she gotten inside? He knew he'd latched that door when he left. Later, when he checked, he saw the truth. The wood around the lock was cracked, the bar half torn loose. She'd forced her way in, desperate enough to break through a locked door for warmth. He carried an armful of wood back inside. She hadn't moved. The bread was gone, crumbs scattered on the table. She was still wrapped in the blanket, her torn buckskin dress hanging open near the collar, dirt smudging her skin. Her eyes followed him, not defiant anymore, but wary, as if waiting for him to tell her to go. Instead, Jack set the wood beside the hearth and went to work with the pan. He cut strips of dried venison, tossed them in with beans, and set them over the fire. The smell filled the room quickly. She watched his every move. When he slid the plate toward her, she hesitated only a heartbeat before taking it. She ate slow, careful, but with the hunger of someone who hadn't trusted a meal in days. Jack studied her as she ate. He needed to decide what this was. A stranger stopping for a night. A runaway who'd bring trouble to his door. He didn't know yet. All he knew was this: he couldn't throw her out into the cold. Not again. Not after everything he'd already lost. Jack Carter knew one thing for certain. He couldn't in good conscience send her out into that biting cold. When Aiyana Skyfeather finished eating, she quietly pushed the tin plate toward him, lowered her gaze, and folded her hands together on the table. She didn't speak, but the gesture carried the weight of a thank you. Jack gave a single nod. The rest of the morning drifted by in silence. He moved through his chores as usual, fetching water, checking the small corral, fixing the broken hinge on the door. Each time he stepped back inside, she was still there. Silent, still wrapped in his old blanket, her dark eyes following his every move. She didn't try to leave, didn't even look toward the door. By the time the sun climbed higher over the ridge, the decision had already settled deep in Jack's mind. She was staying. It was the kind of slow day where nothing much seemed to happen, but everything quietly shifted beneath the surface. Jack worked through his routine like always, yet every swing of the hammer, every sound of boots on wood felt different now. He wasn't alone anymore. Aiyana stayed on the cot, quiet, as a shadow wrapped tight in the blanket. Her eyes never demanded, never pleaded, just watched. By noon, Jack noticed the basin nearly empty. He'd have to make a trip to the creek. He glanced her way, weighing if she was strong enough to walk. If she was going to last longer than a night under his roof, she needed to move to prove she wasn't dying in that bed. Without a word, he took the bucket from its peg and held it out to her. Her gaze dropped to it, then back to him. For a heartbeat, he thought she might refuse, or maybe she didn't understand. Then slowly she reached out. Her fingers were thin, trembling, but she gripped the handle and pushed herself upright. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, leaving only the torn buckskin clinging to her skin. The neckline had ripped wider seams, frayed, bearing more than she seemed aware of. Jack turned away, pushing the door open first. The cold hit them hard. She followed, barefoot, breath sharp against the morning air. The creek wasn't far, but the path was rough, and she stumbled once her knees hitting the dirt. Jack reached for her, instinctively catching her arm. His hand was firm, but brief, just enough to steady her. She looked up, startled. Not angry, just surprised he hadn't pushed her off. Adjusting her hold on the bucket, she kept walking. When they reached the creek, the water was low and fast, glinting in the pale light. She crouched down, dipping the bucket. The water was icy, and she hissed softly when it hit her fingers, but she didn't pull back. Her bruised hands held steady until the bucket was full. Jack crouched nearby, eyes scanning the ridgelines. Out here, sound carried far, and danger had a habit of finding a man who wasn't paying attention. If anyone saw him out here with her an Apache woman, it'd bring trouble he didn't need. When she tried to lift the full bucket, her arms trembled under the weight. Jack stepped forward, his hand covering hers on the handle. She stiffened for a second, as if afraid he'd take it from her, but he didn't. He just helped her bear the weight, carrying it together, the bucket steady between them. They walked back side by side, her shoulder brushing against his arm whenever the path narrowed. Neither spoke a word. Back inside, he set the water by the hearth. She went to the fire, rubbing warmth into her arms, the wet fabric of her dress clinging to her shape. Her hair had come loose, damp from the creek air falling across her chest in tangled waves. Jack forced his focus back to the basin jaw set tight. It had been too long since another soul had shared this space, and her nearness stirred something he thought had been buried alongside Caroline Everhart. He caught himself glancing at her from the corner of his eye. She noticed. Their eyes met for a heartbeat before she looked away, adjusting the torn edge of her neckline with slow, self-conscious fingers. He didn't know if it was shame or just habit, but the moment hung heavy in the room long after. The day slipped by in quiet rhythm. Jack cut wood for the fire, while she sorted what little food remained on the shelves. Later he saw her stitching his coat, again clumsy, but determined, mending where she'd left off. The stitches weren't pretty, but they held. She didn't ask if he wanted her to do it, and he didn't tell her to stop. It felt like her way of repaying him work for mercy. By evening, the cabin smelled of beans simmering in the pot. Jack served her first, sliding the plate across the table before taking his own. She ate slow, careful this time. For a brief second, her eyes met his and then dropped back to her food. That small exchange said enough. Neither of them had to speak it aloud, but something between them had already shifted. When the meal was done, Aiyana Skyfeather surprised him. Without being asked, she gathered the tin plates, carried them to the basin, and washed them clumsily in the cold water. When she set them to dry, Jack Carter stood watching her the whole time, arms folded, shoulder resting against the wall. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. Her actions said everything she wasn't there to take advantage of him. She wanted to earn her place, however small that might be. That quiet act hit him harder than he cared to admit. She wasn't just another mouth to feed. She was already trying to belong in the only way she knew how. When darkness fell, Jack tossed another log on the fire and sank heavily into his chair. His rifle stayed close as always. The woman, though he still didn't know her name, lay back down on his cot, facing the fire. She didn't ask permission. She simply wrapped herself in the blanket and closed her eyes. Jack stared into the flames, his thoughts spinning like smoke. Keeping her here could bring danger. Whoever had hurt her might still be hunting. If they came, he'd have to stand between them and his home. He wasn't sure if he wanted that fight, but when he looked at her bundled in the blanket, bruises fading in the glow, something inside him eased. She was alive. And that was reason enough for one more day to let her stay. The third night passed quietly, and by morning Jack found himself slipping into the strange rhythm of having someone else in the cabin. He rose before sunrise, as always, the frost biting at his beard while he split kindling in the yard. When he came back in, she was awake, sitting on the edge of the cot blanket draped around her shoulders. Her dark hair hung loose, falling past her collarbone, tangled but drying from the damp night air. She looked stronger, less like a ghost, and more like a woman putting herself back together. Jack poured coffee into 2 tin cups and slid one toward her. She hesitated, then reached for it. Her hand didn't shake as badly this time. The bruise on her cheek had faded from deep purple to yellow, though the rope marks on her wrists still stood out like scars against her skin. Jack caught himself staring longer than he meant to, wondering what kind of men had left those marks. She noticed his eyes tugged her sleeve down and turned her face slightly away. Jack said nothing. He wasn't one for prying truth, he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what she'd been through. Instead, he pushed a small bundle of jerky across the table and motioned for her to eat. She did quietly, eyes on the fire. When she finished, she stood on her own, carried the cup and plate to the basin, and rinsed them with the same cold water. Her movements were slow, stiff, not from laziness, but from a body that had endured too much. He noticed the small wince when she bent, the way her hand pressed against her ribs as if something inside still hurt. She was healing, but far from whole. That morning, Jack saddled his horse. Supplies were running low beans, and venison wouldn't stretch much longer. He needed flour salt and a few things from town. But the thought of leaving her alone in the cabin made his gut tighten. If someone came looking, or worse, if she decided to run, everything could unravel fast. He studied her while tightening the cinch. Should he take her with him? No. A woman bruised, wearing torn buckskin, she'd draw too many eyes. He couldn't explain that kind of trouble. He'd have to trust her to stay. Before mounting, he looked back toward the cabin. She stood in the doorway, the blanket gone. Her shoulders bare beneath the torn neckline of her dress. Her dark eyes held no fear, just something unreadable. He lifted a hand slightly, not a wave, but a silent order. Stay inside. She gave a faint nod. The ride to town and back took half the day. Jack kept to himself, buying only what he needed, speaking to no one longer than a nod required. Yet every time he felt the weight of someone's eyes on him, his chest tightened. It was as if some part of him already sensed the storm that might come. When he rode back into the clearing, the sun was sliding low over the ridge. Smoke drifted from the chimney. His pulse quickened. Inside, the fire was strong, his coat neatly folded over the chair. The stitching was rough, uneven, but it held. She'd mended it again. The floor had been swept clean, ashes pushed aside. She'd done it all quietly with no expectation of thanks. That simple effort, her trying to make herself useful, hit him harder than he'd like to admit. He set the sacks of flour and salt on the table and gave her a slow nod. She met his eyes for a brief moment before looking down again. That night, they ate in silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't empty. It was steady, peaceful even. And when his arm brushed hers while passing the tin, she didn't flinch. Not this time. She didn't completely avoid his gaze, though she never held it for long. When the meal ended, Aiyana Skyfeather reached for his coat again, her slender fingers working at another loose stitch without being asked. Jack Carter sat across from her, silent, watching the tiny, deliberate movements of her hands. For the first time in years, he felt what it meant to have another soul sitting at his table, not as a burden, but as something steadying, grounding. The cabin no longer felt so empty. Later, as the fire burned low, he noticed the blanket slip from her shoulder. The torn neckline of her dress gaped slightly in the glow, revealing the faint curve of her collarbone, the soft rise of her chest in the flickering light. His breath caught, and he turned his eyes toward the flames. He'd been alone too long to mistake longing for comfort. Restraint had been his armor, and he wasn't ready to take it off. Not yet. Still, when she leaned forward to feed the fire, her dark hair spilled loose across her chest, gleaming like silk in the light. He didn't look away as quickly as he should have. She noticed. He saw it in the faint flicker of her eyes, in the soft breath she drew, before settling back onto the cot. Neither spoke of it, but something shifted in the room. Something quiet, electric, unspoken. That night, Jack lay awake long after the fire had burned down to embers, listening to the sound of her breathing across the room. His thoughts wandered why she had come here, what she was running from, and what kind of men might be hunting her. He thought of the danger of the risk he'd taken by letting her stay. He thought of Caroline Everhart and their boy Thomas Carter, and how for years his only company had been ghosts. As the wind rattled the walls and the fire sank low, one truth settled deep in him. He hadn't sent her away. And with every day that passed, that choice was getting harder to undo. The cold that night was crueler than usual. Frost crept along the glass, and the wind scraped at the shutters. Jack had piled extra wood on the fire, but the small cabin still leaked cold through every seam. He'd learned to live with it, hardened to the sting, but she hadn't. He could hear her shifting beneath the blanket, chasing warmth she couldn't find. He sat at the table rifle laid across his knees, eyes fixed on the fire. He told himself he was keeping watch out of habit, out of caution, but that wasn't the truth. He stayed awake because she was there, and he didn't trust what might happen if he closed his eyes. Not because he feared her, no. It was himself he didn't trust. The way his thoughts circled around her presence, the sound of her quiet breathing filling the space that had once been nothing but silence. Another gust of wind howled outside, and Aiyana sat upright on the cot, clutching the blanket tighter. Her dark eyes found him, and for the first time, she spoke. "Cold," she whispered. Her voice was low, rough from disuse, the accent thick, but clear. Jack blinked, startled to hear her speak at all. For days, she'd spoken only through her silence, through her movements, through the way she followed his lead. That one word carried more meaning than a whole conversation. He stood, took his coat from the peg, and laid it gently across her shoulders. She flinched at first, then stilled. The coat was too big, the sleeves swallowing her hands, but the warmth steadied her trembling. She looked up at him again, eyes softer this time, and didn't look away as quickly. Jack crouched near the fire, feeding in another log. The flames climbed high, bathing the room in a steady, amber glow. When he sat again, she was still watching him. After a long silence, she pointed at his chest, then at herself, then pressed her palm flat against the cot, as if to say, "I'll stay." Jack's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what that means out here," he muttered under his breath. But maybe she did. He thought of the risk again. If men like Jed Polk or Rufus Lane came riding through and found her here, there'd be no explaining it. They'd assume the worst, and it wouldn't matter what truth he told. Still, he couldn't look at her healing bruises the way she'd mended his coat or carried water despite her pain and tell her to leave. The scales tipped again further toward keeping her here. As night deepened, the wind screamed through the cracks. Jack stood to check the shutter, pressing it tight against the frame. When he turned back, she was curled beneath the blanket knees, drawn up, trying to stay warm. Without thinking too long, he pulled another wool blanket from the trunk and crossed the room. She stirred when he came close. Eyes wary, but didn't pull away as he spread it over her. His hand lingered for a heartbeat at her arm. Her skin was warm beneath the thin fabric. He pulled back quickly, jaw tightening. She didn't flinch, only watched him with those calm, dark eyes, steady, unreadable. Jack returned to his stool, but tension coiled in his chest. He told himself it was just kindness, the kind a decent man would show anyone in need. But deep down he knew that wasn't the whole truth. He had crossed a line not with his hands, but with his thoughts. Jack Carter had allowed himself to feel again something he hadn't done in years. When the fire burned low, Aiyana Skyfeather stirred on the cot, her voice breaking the quiet. "Your name?" she asked softly, her accent heavy, uncertain. Jack looked up. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him that question inside these four walls. "Jack," he said simply. She nodded once, repeating it like she wanted to memorize the sound. "Jack," she whispered. Then her hand brushed her chest lightly. "Aiyana." Her name settled between them like another log on the fire, real solid grounding. She wasn't just a stranger anymore, not just a shadow that had stumbled into his cabin. She was a person, and now she had a name. He gave her a small nod. She lay back down, eyes closing, breathing deep and even for the first time since she'd arrived. Jack sat there a long while, whispering her name in his mind. Aiyana. He thought about how she'd broken into his cabin half dead, how he'd let her stay, how the bruises on her wrists had begun to fade, how she'd stitched his coat, carried water, swept the floor without being told. And now she'd given him her name. By the time he stretched out on the floor beside the fire rifle within reach, the truth was clear. Sending her away was no longer an option. The risk was real, but the decision was already made. She was here, and he'd let her stay. That night, Jack didn't fall asleep to the familiar silence. He fell asleep to the sound of her breathing steady, alive, filling the cabin with something he thought he'd lost forever. When morning came, his back ached from the floor, but warmth lingered in the room. The fire had burned to coals, casting a faint orange glow. He looked up to see Aiyana awake, sitting on the cot with the blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. Her dark hair hung heavy and unbraided, her face calm, almost peaceful. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She was simply there, steady as the light through the window. Jack sat up, rubbing the stiffness from his arms. "Morning," he muttered out of habit. She tilted her head, not quite catching the word, then gave him the faintest smile, one that disappeared as quickly as it came. They shared breakfast beans, simmered in the pan, jerky cut into thin strips. Neither spoke much, but now that he knew her name, she tried harder to communicate. When she wanted salt, she pointed to the sack and said the word slowly. When he handed her water, she murmured something soft in her own language, a quiet thank you he didn't understand, but somehow felt. Each small gesture chipped away at the wall between them. Still unease lingered. Jack caught himself watching her too long. The curve of her shoulders as she bent over the basin, the way the torn buckskin clung to her hips, when she moved the faint shimmer of skin at her neckline, when she leaned near the fire. Most of the time he turned away. Sometimes he didn't. And when their eyes met, she didn't always look away either. That evening the wind came hard from the north, slamming against the cabin walls. Jack stacked the hearth high, but cold still crept through every gap. Aiyana sat close to the fire, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, her bare arms bathed in the flicker of flame. She rubbed her hands slowly, eyes half closed in fatigue. Jack sat across from her, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, but his eyes wandered again and again. He fought himself for it. It had been so long since another human sound had filled this room. Since Carolyn Everhart died, the cabin had been a tomb. But tonight, there was life again. The crack of the fire, the soft rustle of her blanket, even the quiet hum of her voice as she whispered words he couldn't understand. All of it stirred something deep in him. Then she leaned forward to feed the fire. The blanket slid lower. The neckline of her dress fell open, the light tracing the soft line of her chest. Jack drew a sharp breath and set the knife down hard against the table. She turned her head at the sound and met his gaze. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. Then she didn't cover herself. The blanket stayed where it had fallen. Jack's pulse pounded in his chest. He'd sworn long ago he would never open himself again, never risk the kind of loss that had gutted him before. But here she was, alive, quiet, unafraid, and she had chosen to stay. Something about that choice. Her choice cut deeper than anything he'd felt in years. He rose slowly and crossed the room. She shifted, but didn't move away. The heat from the fire and her body blurred together between them. For a long moment, he just looked at her, searching her face for fear. There was none. Only weariness, a spark of defiance, and something else trust. His hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed against her arm. Her skin was warm, softer than he expected. And for the first time in a very long while, Jack Carter didn't feel like a ghost living among memories. He felt alive again. She flinched at first, but didn't move away. Her dark eyes locked on his. "Aiyana," Jack Carter said softly, her name rolling off his tongue like a vow he hadn't meant to speak. She drew in a sharp breath and leaned closer. The space between them vanished in a heartbeat. His lips brushed hers, tentative searching, like one wrong move could shatter everything they had quietly built in that fragile cabin. But when she didn't pull away, when she pressed back, the years of restraint inside him broke loose. The kiss deepened, slow and desperate, his hand finding the curve of her waist. He held her there, as if anchoring himself to something he'd forgotten he needed. When they finally parted, the firelight glowed across her face, flushed, soft, unafraid. She didn't speak. Instead, she rested her head gently against his chest, her breath steadying against him. Jack closed his eyes, his hand still resting at her side, and let out a long, uneven breath. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb. It felt alive again, filled with warmth, breath, and something new neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. That night, when Jack lay on the floor beside the fire, her breathing filled the cabin once more, but it was different now. Closer, softer, carrying the weight of something that couldn't be undone. He stared at the rafter's rifle within reach and understood one thing with piercing clarity: he'd crossed a line. Outside danger still waited in the shadows. But inside those 4 log walls, he wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, the cabin felt changed. Jack woke early, the air still heavy with the memory of the night before. He stirred the coals, poured water into the pot, and brewed coffee, though the silence between them no longer felt empty. It was a silence that knew. When Aiyana Skyfeather stirred on the cot, drawing the blanket closer, he caught her watching him through the flicker of firelight. There was no fear in her eyes now, just calm, and something steady that rooted him to the spot. She didn't speak, but the memory of their kiss lingered between them, quiet, but unshakable. Jack spent most of the day outside, working the corral fence, hammering rails back into place. He needed movement, something to keep his hands busy, so his mind wouldn't circle back to what had happened by the fire. But each time he glanced toward the cabin and saw the thin ribbon of smoke curling upward, he felt the pull of what he'd chosen. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She belonged here now, and protecting her, whatever that meant, had become his burden to bear. When he returned near midday, he found her sitting at the table, patching the torn seam of her dress with the old needle and thread he'd left behind. Her stitches were uneven, but she was trying. She looked up as he entered her eyes, sharp and steady. He noticed she'd braided her long black hair to one side, neat and simple. She'd done what she could with what little she had an effort to make herself part of this place, not just a guest. Before he could speak, the sound of hoofbeats broke through the stillness outside. Jack froze. His hand went straight to the rifle by the door. Aiyana stiffened, color draining from her face. The hoofbeats slowed the creak of leather and tack echoing in the cold air. Then a voice called out, deep and familiar. "Carter, you in there?" Jack's pulse kicked. He turned to Aiyana, who had already slipped from the chair and crouched behind the cot, clutching the blanket tight around her. He gave her a firm nod, "Stay hidden," then stepped outside. Wade Bonner sat astride his horse hat, pulled low against the sun. "Saw smoke yesterday when I rode by," he said, his eyes scanning the cabin. "Figured I'd stop in." "You don't usually keep the fire burning this long unless the cold's been biting." Jack met his gaze, jaw tight. "Just keeping it going," he said evenly. "Cold's meaner this year." Bonner studied him for a long, heavy moment. Then he spat into the dirt. "You'd best keep an eye out," he warned. "Word in town is two fellas Jed Polk and Rufus Lane been passing through. Said they're hunting a runaway Apache girl. Claimed she stole from 'em." Jack's stomach turned, but his voice stayed steady. "I'll keep watch." Bonner gave a curt nod, tugged his reins, and rode off toward the ridge. Jack stood there until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, then turned back to the cabin, every muscle tight. He knew what that meant, what he'd suspected since the night he found her bleeding on his bed. Someone was coming for her. And when they did, they wouldn't care about her bruises, her fear, or her right to freedom. To men like them, she was property. And if he stood in their way, it would come down to guns. Inside, Aiyana hadn't moved. She crouched behind the cot, her breath, quick eyes wide, the same look he'd seen in soldiers waiting for the fight to start. Jack set the rifle down and crouched beside her, his voice low, steady, even though his heart was hammering. "They're looking for you," he said slowly, knowing she might not understand every word, but hoping she could feel the truth in his tone. "They'll come." "Aiyana." Skyfeather's voice trembled, but her eyes stayed locked on his. Then, with unsteady fingers, she reached out and touched Jack Carter's arm. It was the first time she had reached for him not out of fear or need, but by choice. That small gesture carried more weight than any kiss. She was trusting him now, trusting him to stand between her and whatever waited beyond that frozen ridge. That night the fire burned long and hot, but neither of them found much rest. Jack sat near the door rifle across his lap, every muscle alert, listening for the crunch of hooves or the low murmur of men outside. Aiyana lay curled near the hearth, both blankets wrapped tight around her. When her eyes met his across the flickering light, they didn't need words. He wasn't just sheltering her anymore. He was protecting her. And she, knowing what danger might come, had chosen not to run, not to hide in the hills, but to stay beneath his roof. In that heavy silence, something unspoken but solid settled between them. For the first time since his wife and son had been buried beneath the Wyoming soil, Jack Carter knew exactly where he stood. He would not let her be taken. The next day passed beneath the weight of that understanding, though neither of them spoke of it. Jack worked his chores as usual, splitting wood, hauling water, checking the traps along the ridge, but every sound from the tree line made his hand drift toward the colt at his hip. Every crack of a branch, every crow's cry, every whisper of wind that didn't sound quite natural. Aiyana felt it too. She stayed close to the cabin, her sharp eyes sweeping the tree line each time the wind shifted. By late afternoon, the clouds had gathered thick and gray, heavy with sleet that stung the skin. Jack worked fast, stacking firewood high against the wall before barring the shutters tight. Inside, Aiyana tended the fire, her face drawn with worry. She hadn't said much all day, but her silence had changed. It carried fear now, not caution. When Jack came back in, shaking the wet from his coat, she turned sharply toward him, both blankets draped around her shoulders. "Men?" she asked, her voice strained but clear. "Not yet," he answered, low and steady. He took the rifle down from its peg, thumbed open the chamber, and checked each round. His fingers stayed calm, though his chest felt tight as a drum. Years on the frontier had taught him one thing. Men who wanted trouble didn't come in daylight. They came when the dark and the storm worked in their favor. As night fell, the sleet thickened into heavy snow, hammering the cabin walls. The fire threw tall, dancing shadows that made the room feel smaller. Aiyana sat close to the hearth, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, eyes following him as he cleaned his rifle. Finally, she spoke again, her voice shaking but strong enough to hold. "They take me, chain." Her hands lifted, tracing the faded rope marks on her wrists. Her breath caught, but she forced the words through. "I run! If they find, they kill you." Jack froze, hand resting on the revolver. For days he'd avoided asking, avoided forcing her to relive whatever hell had brought her here. But now the truth came out plain and brutal. She had been taken chained like an animal, and when she escaped, she'd run straight into his world. If those men came back, they wouldn't stop until they dragged her away again. He stood crossed the room and crouched beside her. She tensed, but didn't pull back. His voice was firm, steady. "They're not taking you," he said. "Not while I'm here." The fire popped between them, the only sound in the cabin. Then she reached up slow and laid her hand against his chest. The gesture was small, but it said everything. She believed him. The storm outside howled louder sleet, turning to driving snow. Inside, the air felt tighter, heavier. Jack sat near the door, again, rifle across his knees, his ears tuned to every sound. Aiyana stayed by the fire, glancing toward him, again and again, as if drawing strength just from knowing he was there. Near midnight, he heard a sound so faint it might have been the wind. But it wasn't. Hoofbeats. Jack's back straightened his hand, closing around the rifle stock. He moved to the window, eased one shutter open, just enough to see through the slit. Lantern light swayed in the darkness. Two riders moving slow snow swirling around them. His stomach went hard as stone. He shut the shutter quietly and turned back. Aiyana was standing now, her face pale, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She already knew. Jack crossed the room in 2 strides, gripped her arm gently, and pointed toward the corner behind the bed. "Stay there," he whispered. "Don't move unless I tell you." At first she shook her head, fear flashing in her eyes, but then she obeyed, sinking low into the shadows. A hard knock thundered against the door. A voice cut through the storm, rough and taunting Carter. "Word is you've been keeping what ain't yours. Hand her over, we'll save you the trouble." Jack Carter's jaw locked tight. He rose to his feet, rifle gripped firm, and planted himself square in front of the door. His pulse hammered in his chest, but his voice came out steady as iron. "There's nothing here for you." Laughter came from outside, dark and mean, swallowed by the wind. "We'll see about that." The latch rattled. Jack set his boots, wide shoulders squared, the firelight casting his shadow long across the cabin floor. Behind him, Aiyana Skyfeather's sharp breath broke the silence. Her eyes gleamed in the dim light, wide with fear, yet filled with something deeper trust. For years, this cabin had been nothing but a tomb for his grief. Tonight, it became his fortress. The first kick hit the door hard enough to rattle the hinges. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. The wind howled. The fire roared, and he knew then there was no turning back. He had made his choice. The door shuddered under a second heavy blow, snow shaking loose from the roof. Jack braced the rifle to his shoulder, breath steady despite the pounding in his veins. He had faced fights before, men trying to steal cattle land or pride, but this was different. This was for her. For the woman crouched in the corner, clutching a blanket to her chest, counting on him to stand his ground. A third kick splintered the frame. A voice barked through the storm, low and final. "Last chance, Carter. Step aside." "Not happening," Jack growled. The next impact broke the latch clean off. The door swung wide, snow swirling in, as two men burst through Jed Polk, first thick-shouldered and red-faced, a pistol in one hand and a lantern in the other. Behind him came Rufus Lane, lean, snake-eyed, a coil of rope hanging from his belt. They stomped inside as if they owned the place. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired. The rifle cracked like thunder, the confined space swallowing the sound and filling it with smoke. Jed staggered back, the lantern dropping and bursting into flame on the floor. Jack kicked it aside, snuffing the fire with his boot, never lowering his aim. Rufus shouted and raised his pistol. The gunshot split the air, his bullet burying itself in the log wall inches from Jack's head. Jack pivoted, cocked, and fired again. The second man hit the ground hard, collapsing half in the doorway, his last breath vanishing into the storm. Silence followed. Only the hiss of the fire and Aiyana's ragged breathing filled the cabin. Jack reloaded quickly, eyes sharp, scanning the dark tree line beyond the open door. Nothing moved but snow, thick, endless snow falling like a curtain between them and the world. He dragged both bodies outside, rolling them down the slope into the drifts. By dawn, the storm would erase every trace. Maybe someday the law would come asking, but out here, men who hunted women like animals didn't leave names anyone remembered. When Jack shut the door and barred it again, he found Aiyana Skyfeather standing near the hearth. She had left her hiding place, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those deep, steady eyes, did not waver. She crossed the room slowly, her bare feet whispering across the wooden floor, until she stood before him. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Then Aiyana Skyfeather lifted her hand, placed it over his chest, right where his heart still hammered, and whispered, her voice trembling but clear, "Safe." Jack Carter's throat tightened. He set the rifle down beside the hearth, exhaled long and heavy, and gave a slow nod. "Safe," he repeated. That night they sat close to the fire, the storm still raging beyond the walls. Aiyana leaned into him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. He felt the warmth of her against him, the rise and fall of her breath, and something deep inside him, something he thought had long turned to stone, began to thaw. He had lived too many years in silence, surrounded only by loss and memory. But now there was life in the room again. Warmth where cold had ruled. When morning came, the storm had passed. The land lay blanketed in white, glistening under a pale sun. Smoke rose steady from the chimney, straight into the still sky. Jack stepped outside, the snow crunching under his boots, and Aiyana followed. They stood together at the edge of the clearing, the quiet stretching wide around them. For the first time, she didn't look like someone ready to flee. Her shoulders were squared, her gaze fixed ahead, strong, calm, unafraid. Jack turned toward her, his voice low. "You don't have to leave." She studied him with those dark, searching eyes. Then slowly she reached out and placed her hand in his. It wasn't a plea nor a promise, it was a choice. Back inside the fire still glowed bright. The air smelled of coffee and pine. Jack brought out another chair from the shed, one that had sat unused since Carolyn Everhart's death, and placed it at the table. This time it wasn't for ghosts. It was for her, the woman who had chosen to stay. Days turned into weeks. The bruises faded from her arms, the color returned to her cheeks. She grew stronger, and their words, his English, her tongue of the Skyfeather tribe began to find each other. They cooked together, hauled water from the creek, split wood, and moved through their days with an easy rhythm born of quiet understanding. The danger had passed, but what it left behind was something deeper, something neither of them could name. Yet both felt in every shared glance, every small act. By the first thaw of spring, the cabin no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like a home. Jack Carter was no longer a man haunted by ghosts, and Aiyana Skyfeather, no longer a runaway nor a stranger, had become his. Not through words or vows, but through the simple unspoken truth of staying. And out there on the far edge of Wyoming territory, where the wind cut hard and life was never promised, that was more than enough.